Hello, everyone. It's another edition of your Energy Frontiers. I am Justina Okechukwu. Here are some of the biggest headlines across the African energy markets as the United Nations COP27 Summit is still underway in Egypt. The international partners group comprising of the United Kingdom, the US, Germany, France, and the European Union has pledged to deliver an additional $562 million to South Africa's Just Energy Transition Partnership Plan, following an initial $8.5 billion pledge made during COP26 last year. Kenya and the United Kingdom has announced plans to hit the ground running on the implementation of climate projects worth 500 billion Kenyan shillings or $4.1 billion in the East African country. The UK government this week announced an increase in its funding support to African countries with an additional £200 million to the African Development Bank's Climate Action Window, a new mechanism set up to channel finance to help vulnerable countries adapt to the impacts of climate change. Egypt's oil minister Tarek El Molla says the country is on course to achieve its goal of delivering 42% of its energy needs from renewables well before the 2035 targets set out in its existing energy strategy. Africa's leading electric two-wheeler, M-Auto, has announced the first closing of a $5 million transaction in the voluntary carbon offset market. The deal is the largest in Africa in terms of carbon credits for electric mobility. Sudan's energy ministry has raised the price of car petrol to 620 Sudanese pounds per litre from 522 pounds per litre, according to a statement on Thursday. The price of diesel was raised to 722 pounds per litre from 672 pounds. Next on Energy Frontiers, we follow the news as well as the money behind the discussions at the ongoing 27th United Nations Climate Change Conference in Egypt. This is Energy Frontiers. Welcome back to the program. It's been a busy week for the global energy and climate industry. The opening plenary of the COP27 Summit began with the election of Egypt's Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry as the president of the 27th Conference of Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. In his address, the Egyptian minister asked countries to show faith in multilateralism during the conference as they negotiate to deliver on the goals of the Climate Convention and the Paris Agreement.
All types of evidence undoubtedly show that climate change is a real threat to people's lives, wherever they live and in all forms. Science proves that the development track humanity has endorsed since the Industrial Revolution and until recently is no longer sustainable, and that if it will continue without any radical change, future generations will definitely face more serious consequences compared to those witnessed by current generations. Despite all goodwill, despite all the serious efforts, science confirms once again and through various reports, namely the IPCC report. So science confirms that we are still facing growing gaps, whether keeping up with the Paris Accord climate target or adapting with the negative impacts of the climate change, or also providing necessary finance so that developing countries can fulfill their role. We have witnessed during this year painful events in Pakistan, in the African continent, and in various parts of Europe and America. All these events and their destruction and impact represent a lesson to be learned and a sounding alarm all over the planet. A wake-up call inviting us to more precaution and to act quickly to take all necessary measures as per our commitments and pledges. Ladies and gentlemen, it is clear to all of us that our conference is held this year amid political tensions that left their deep impact on all our countries, namely the crises in energy and food supplies. If some people think that such challenges will hamper international collective action in the field of climate action, on the contrary, we here in Sharm El Sheikh need to prove the contrary. That's why I invite you all to show the whole world that we are aware of the challenge awaiting us and that we have the political will to counter it. That's why we have constantly called for moving from negotiations and pledges to an era of implementation as a priority, as well as the acceleration of implementation of what we have agreed upon with the UNFCCC, promoted in the Paris Accord and the work program, while mentioning the importance of scaling up ambitions according to the country's capacities and natures of their resources. I would like to commend the countries that have updated their NDCs, including Egypt, and I represent you all. I trust I speak on behalf of all of you when I call upon countries to do the same, especially that the NDC synthesis report revealed that the current level of ambitions is not up to the Paris goals. In this context, it is worth mentioning that for the sake of an efficient implementation of pledges and commitments, we need a more efficient and wider participation by all relevant parties from non-state actors whose role is equally important to that of the role of the states, namely private sector, banks, international finance institutions, civil society, youth associations, indigenous associations, and others.
Coming up next, we turn our attention to AFDB's policy dialogue on supporting climate resilience and just energy transition in Africa. I am Justina Okechukwu. Let's continue the show. The African Development Bank Group and Africa 50, in partnership with the African Union and other global partners, announced at COP27 a new alliance that will support Africa's climate infrastructure needs and drive towards net zero emissions. Let's listen to the AFDB president, Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, as he raised the curtain on the latest initiative.
Globally, Africa's share 0.26%, the lowest share of any region in the world. The same can be said in terms of green loans. Africa's share is 1.9%. In terms of global issuances of sustainability bonds and sustainability-linked loans and bonds, Africa's share 1%. So the shift to accelerating the development of green infrastructure will open up great opportunities for the launch of more green bonds and crowding institutional investors that are driven increasingly by environmental, social, and governance ESG criteria in their investment decisions. By focusing on the development of green infrastructure, Africa can increase the share of green bonds that it accounts for to roughly 2.5% globally. And that means we can crowd in at least $14 billion in green financing to boost Africa's green infrastructure assets. The Alliance for Green Infrastructure is being established to close the infrastructure financing gap, build sustainable and resilient infrastructure for Africa, mobilize African and global institutional investors, and several of you are here today, to invest in quality green infrastructure, to also speed up the scale that's needed for accelerating Africa's transition to to net zero. The focus, therefore, is to develop low-carbon, climate-resilient infrastructure for Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, AGIA will mobilize the private sector capital at scale to support the greening of Africa's infrastructure. But let's look at the assets under management globally to see what we can do. Globally, you have $103 trillion of assets under management. If we're able to get just 0.03 to 0.04% of that, we will literally close all of Africa's infrastructure financing gap. AGIA will deploy its resources, partnerships, and instruments to green existing brown infrastructure in Africa. Let me give you a few examples. Converting heavy fuel and diesel plants to gas hybrid and power industries, greening non-power infrastructure, especially transport systems in Africa, using compressed natural gas, capturing flared gas all over the place and turning that into liquefied petroleum gas that we need for cooking, gas to power, and of course the manufacture of fertilizers. We see new opportunities for green asset recycling, as well as the development of green hydrogen and large-scale renewable projects such as the $20 billion Desert to Power initiative that the African Development Bank is leading to construct what will be the largest solar zone in the world in the Sahel and provide electricity for 250 million Africans via the power of the solar. We also envisage infrastructure that will support new green industries, especially the development of lithium-ion batteries in Africa to position Africa to benefit significantly from the electric car market that will be worth $354 billion by 2028.
It's about the figures on climate conversations at COP27 Summit in Egypt, and the African Development Bank hosted a policy dialogue that points to the economics of climate resilience and just energy transition for Africa. Here is Professor Kevin Urama, Vice President and Acting Chief Economist at the AFDB, speaking to the AFDB's report. Let's listen.
Just to paint the picture, Africa's growth has always been resilient, going up and down for several reasons, which I'm not going to go into, because this is not the main theme of the presentation today. But if you look at it, you can find that during the COVID-19, Africa had a recession, contracting to 1.6% of its GDP, but it rebounded in 2021. But because of the confluence of factors, climate, conflicts, and other things, Africa's growth has always continued to go up and down. But the good thing is that we have seen resilience as a characteristic of Africa's growth all the time. So even after COVID-19, this picture is showing us that in all regions of the continent was able to rebound to positive growth. Whether you think about the regions of the continent or the types of structures of Africa's economies, people will be wondering, why am I talking about macroeconomic issues when we are talking about climate change? I'm going to show you the links between that growth and poverty with climate resilience and also just energy transitions in a very short while. So Africa has major challenges in its growth, one of which is on debt overhang. And I'm raising this because we're here at COP27 and we're discussing climate finance. And a lot of the climate finance that is being given to Africa comes in as debt instruments. And that again compounds this already big challenge of debt overhang on the continent. So that when we're discussing climate finance and climate resilience, we need to think about growth, we need to think about poverty reduction, and we also need to think about other socioeconomic and global development goals that we have. And then if we look at what Africa is already going through because of COVID, we need over $432 billion for recovering from COVID-19 alone. And that amount of money is something we need for an impact that is external to Africa, just like climate change is external to Africa. And a lot of the gains already made in terms of poverty reduction and socioeconomic goals, other SDGs, we saw a big reversals in them, with over 30 million people being pulled into poverty. That's just to set the context that it's not only climate that Africa needs to deal with, but needs to deal with other socioeconomic and sustainable development goals. So when we delve into this issue around climate resilience, what does it mean for Africa? In that report, we find that in terms of climate vulnerability, climate readiness, and climate resilience, Africa is the second to South Asia in terms of climate vulnerability, the height of climate vulnerability around the global regions. But even at that, Africa is the least climate ready of all continents of the world. And this is because of several factors, again, economic structures of the economy, in terms of capacity for adaptation, financing, and several things that we need to consider as well. If you combine those two indicators and look at climate vulnerability and climate resilience, Africa is again the least resilient of many parts of the world. And we try to look deep into it and find out what's the reason for this lack of resilience in Africa, given that Africa is not emitting a lot of climate-forcing emissions, and including CO2. And on the right panel there, you see we try to disaggregate by countries. And we find that climate resilience and climate vulnerability is highly correlated to economic growth. The more your GDP is growing, the more resilient you are to climate change and to climate shocks. So the poorer countries are more vulnerable to climate change. And that's obvious because you don't have the infrastructure, you don't have the institutions, you don't have the capacity to adapt to climate change. So this analysis already tells us we cannot delink socioeconomic growth from climate resilience that we're discussing here and from climate policies. So if you look at the impacts of climate change in terms of when we discuss loss and damage, in Africa, you'll find that Africa is already losing 5 to 15% of its GDP growth per capita between 1986 and 2015.
Energy Frontiers has more in the package from the high-profile Global Climate Summit. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the program. Another high point of the two-week COP27 conference was the launch of a new Africa Carbon Markets Initiative led by a 13-member steering committee of African leaders, chief executive officers, and carbon credit experts aimed at supporting the growth of carbon credit production and create jobs in Africa. Kenya, Gabon, Malawi, Nigeria, and Togo share their commitments to collaborate with the new initiative and to scale up carbon credit production via voluntary market activation plans. Here is Kenya's new president, William Ruto, calling for speedy capitalization of climate change finance mechanisms.
Failure to redeem these pledges, therefore, implicates the leadership of the developed countries of negligence with dire humanitarian consequences. This is an action moment, a financial moment, and a moral moment for global leadership. We must rise to meet it without flinching. It is in this spirit that I therefore call for the speedy capitalization of existing climate finance mechanisms, that is both under the Convention and Paris Agreement. I also call for the development of innovative modalities to mobilize additional climate financing, the operationalization of carbon markets under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement would go a long way in this respect. Finally, I emphasize the need for funding under these frameworks to be adequate, timely, and accessible in order to be effective. Successful adaptation is not about making incremental or piecemeal investments. Rather, it is about understanding, intending, and doing development differently. It is about systematically taking account of both present and future climate risks. Adaptation and development are inextricably linked and reciprocal, and credible adaptation actions deliver considerable development outcomes. Accordingly, the achievement of the Africa Union's Agenda 2063 will require African countries to rapidly accelerate the implementation of adaptation plans. I urge all of us to make this COP the implementation COP. Let us all be mindful that we are in a potential existential moment, if not for all humanity, then most certainly for many communities, especially vulnerable people in developing countries, including Africa. Our negotiations are not all about hard-nosed bargaining for financial commitments. Due recognition of the distinct moral component underlying our proceedings should convince us to tone down hard, zero-sum positions, direct our focus to collective problem-solving, and enable us to develop resolutions that will lead to a successful COP27. As an African COP, let us make Sharm El Sheikh the COP of effective decisions, resolute implementation, and ambitious action.
And this is how we draw the curtain on this week's edition of the show, and we hope you enjoyed it. Remember to follow the program on Frontier Africa Report's website and across all our social media handles as indicated on the screen. I am Justina Okechukwu. Bye for now.